In honor of Halloween this month, I thought I'd bring back an old segment, History of. Hey movie fans, so to celebrate Halloween, you know I'm doing all kinds of October and Halloween related videos this month, and the one I'm most excited to bring to you guys is History of Horror Movies. I really enjoy doing History of Special Effects for you guys, those two parts. If you want to see them, just check out the link, or I'll put it somewhere on the screen here. And I really have wanted to do History of Horror Movies for a very long time, so I'm so excited. Let's not waste any more time. Let's kick us off right at 1920. Go in that way back machine. Buckle up your seatbelts because we're going to throw a lot of information over these next 4 weeks, as I'm planning to do it every Friday will be a new installment of History of Horror Movies. So we're in the year 1920 with the film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is more European in its style as the Europeans produced it. As you'll see throughout as our journey throughout the history of horror movies, America and Europe kind of flip-flop between who is the dominant creative force when it comes to horror movies, but Europe really started it off with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1920, and then the film industry kind of followed up in 1922 with Nosferatu. Both of these were black and white, really artistic, low-budget affairs, with the low budget actually adding to it. A lot of these sets in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari were actually painted and weren't actually there. Like the shadows were painted on as opposed to lighting, creating shadows, which actually made it creepier and more atmospheric. So, across the pond and here in America, we had The Hunchback of Notre Dame as one of the first major horror films that we produced. The film starred the original Lon Chaney Sr., whose son would also join the horror industry, but we'll check in with him in a little bit. Lon Chaney Sr. starred in a lot of different early horror films for Universal Studios, who would be one of the pioneers of the horror industry. They produced, for their first horror movies, they produced Hunchback of Notre Dame and Phantom of the Opera, both starring Lon Chaney Sr. As you can probably pick up, both of these movies are originally based off of novels, Hunchback of Notre Dame and Phantom of the Opera. This is a recurring theme for Universal's early horror movies, with films like Dracula and Frankenstein both originally being books, one by Bram Stoker and another by Mary Shelley. Speaking of Dracula, Carl Laemmle Jr. was the head of Universal at the time. Universal was run with a lot of nepotism, so originally Universal was run by Carl Laemmle Sr., and he thought, you know what? No one's better to run the company than my own son. Whereas Carl Laemmle Jr., who was very young at the time, wanted to go in a radically different idea because he was a rebel, and rebels only bring good things, as you know. So he wanted to branch on this developing world of horror, and he really wanted to bring Dracula to the big screen. It was already a successful stage adaptation, and so he lobbied to get the rights from Bram Stoker's widow, who was still alive at the time. When Laemmle Jr. eventually got the rights to Dracula, he cast Bela Lugosi, who was a well-known stage actor at the time, in the role of Dracula, which would later become iconic. If you watch the film of Dracula, though, it's aged particularly well, due in no small part to its sound design. If you listen carefully, there's no actual background music. It's one of the first horror movies, or even movies with dialogue, as characters are actually talking to them and you can hear them. However, there's no background music like we have in a lot of horror movies today. There's actually a solid reason for that, and it actually adds to the film. At the time, filmmakers were still toying with the notion of noise and sound in movies, and so they thought having background music would confuse the audience unless there's physically an instrument in the scene, like someone playing a gigantic organ, then you have organ music. If there's nothing on the screen, they thought audience members would be confused as to, where's this music coming from? That's why there's this eerie silence for a lot of Dracula, and I think, in my mind, it adds a lot to the uncertainty of the film, as you're just kind of in suspense, because, in my mind, the best horror movies are the ones with the best use of sound design. Like The Strangers is terrifying because there's no background music at all, and it's wonderful, it's terrifying. Dracula proved to be a smash hit for Universal, and so they wanted to keep the trend going with another book adaptation, this time Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Dracula's Bela Lugosi was originally offered the part because they wanted to keep him as the face of horror, but Bela Lugosi didn't want that, and so the role eventually went to Boris Karloff, who had been acting for a significant amount of time, but really could never push through that glass ceiling. He could never grasp that brass ring. He was in so much stuff, but nothing that anybody really remembered him for. He was like Jeremy Piven of the movie world, basically. However, for the more modern movie fan, you may know the name Boris Karloff better as the narrator in The Grinch, the original Grinch cartoon. Frankenstein was also a smash hit for Universal, and so, continuing the trend of a lot of horror movies to this day, the creators at Universal thought, this worked well, let's just keep churning out sequels for this franchise. And you think we have a problem with sequels and remakes today? Turns out, it's a lot older of a problem than we think it was. So Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff were kind of typecast as these characters for the rest of their careers. If it wasn't respectively Dracula or Frankenstein, it was something in the horror genre, as Boris Karloff was a lot of different roles. However, Boris Karloff enjoyed being in the horror genre. He always said that a lot of people didn't see my early work, so this provides me stable work, and I know where my next paycheck will be coming from. Whereas Bela Lugosi was not a huge fan of being typecast. He fell on hard times and really struggled with the idea that this is all he would be remembered for, because he viewed himself as a more prestigious actor. I was a well-known stage actor, which was kind of rough for him. However, I think history has been kind to him in that he is proven to be a great pioneer in horror acting genre, as he was well ahead of his time, and he really did get a happy ending. But we'll get to how him and Boris Karloff were eventually written off screens. However, by the mid-1930s, Universal hit hard financial times, and they really were bankrupt creatively and financially, and really didn't know what direction to go. So, they re-released Dracula and Frankenstein in theaters, thinking, maybe we can get at least some money, because it's not going to cost a whole bunch of money to re-release it. It's not like we're making a movie up from scratch, and we'll get at least some profit. The re-releases proved to be a smash hit, and Universal thought, maybe we gave up on the horror genre too quickly. This ushered in numerous more horror films, including The Wolfman, played by Lon Chaney Jr., following in his father's footsteps of famous makeup artist that loves the horror genre and played a variety of different characters. We then fast forward to 1942, where RKO Productions, yes, that's actually a production company, and I'm just gonna leave this here, because RKO Productions and Val Lewton created the film called Cat People in 1942. The title may sound dumb, but this film sticks in film history, and especially horror history, for one reason, and one reason in particular. It's the first film to introduce jump scares, a horror movie staple. Now, defining jump scares is basically jumping at something that's not actually scary, but is presented in a scary way, and it's just horror cliche number one. Val Lewton is known for that. We often call them jump scares, but back in the day they were called a Lewton bus, because the scene in question was a woman thinking that someone's following her when a loud bus drives right past her. It doesn't run her over, but it goes right past her, and you're startled by the noise. It's very abrupt and terrifying. That's something that horror movies would follow to this day, and that has origins all the way back to 1942. In response to this second wave of popularity that Universal's horror movies were getting, they decided to do crossovers, kind of like the Avengers movies are getting today. So that way we got movies like Frankenstein meets The Wolfman, which also proved to be incredibly lucrative for Universal. However, just like any other major horror franchise, the more sequels, the less popularity there was each time around, as less and less money trickled in, and again, Universal fell on hard financial times. So, as they did once before, Universal tried to bring up horror one last time. This time, they thought, you know what, why not incorporate some comedy into horror? So let's try and, last-ditch effort to get us out of these hard financial times by bringing in two of the biggest comedy names of our generation at the time, Abbott and Costello. They brought in Abbott and Costello for a Frankenstein-esque movie. They brought back Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff as their more or less final roles in horror genre meets Abbott and Costello. How did the film do? It was a bona fide success and revitalized Universal's interest in the genre and proved to be a wonderful send-off for both Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi's horror careers, as that was essentially the last we ever saw of them in any kind of horror foray. The film was a smash hit, but it also kind of ended the first main era of horror popularity with Universal. It kind of ended that Universal monster golden age. However, while we may have dried up creatively in the horror department in America, as we'll see next week, our friends across the pond were just starting to get a little more creative with the ideas that we had already brought to the table. Well, what did you guys think of part 1 of History of Horror? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you like what you've seen and want to see more, subscribe to the channel, or find me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Uncharted Media. Stay sharp, movie guys and gals!